Thanks, Justine. My name is Aidan Milliff. I'm a PhD candidate in political science at MIT, and I am your cruise director for the last panel of today, Experiencing Violence and Post-Conflict Outcomes. I'll just really quickly give a rundown on who's on the panel, and then we will jump straight into people's opening remarks. So we're joined today by four excellent panelists who are going to talk to us about post-conflict socio and political outcomes and how that connects to the themes that we've been discussing today. Our first panelist is Phuong Pham, who's an assistant professor and director of evaluation and implementation science at the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative and Harvard Medical School. We're also joined by Lauren Young, who's an assistant professor of political science at University of California, Davis. And then by two people who you already know if you've been at earlier parts of the conference today. That's Justine Davis, who is the LSA Collegiate Fellow in the Department of Afroamerican and African Studies at University of Ann Arbor, and Biz Herman, who's a PhD candidate in political science at UC Berkeley. So we are going to jump straight into things, and I will turn it over to Justine and Biz for their opening remarks.
Thanks, Aidan. We are working collaboratively and are going to present collaboratively, so we're going to try and tag team this. Justine will share some slides and we'll sort of walk through a little bit about what brings us to this work, but also a collaborative project we're working on, and also sort of talk broadly about the themes that we've been discussing here today. So my name is Biz Herman, and I'm a PhD candidate at the University of California, Berkeley in political science. And my research really focuses on the ways in which mental health impacts social cohesion in post-conflict and forced migration settings. And I specifically examine the way that trauma exposure and subsequent trauma responses, including trauma-related distress, affect factors that are really of interest to political scientists. So things like intergroup trust, prosociality, and support for conflict and reconciliation. And these things, you know, the goal would be to eventually maybe look at the ways in which these in turn impact the prospects for peace and security in the future. So as we've talked about a lot here today, if you've been here for some of the other panels, research on the individual impacts of living through and beyond conflict and forced migration has really proliferated in recent years, and especially in the field of political science. This has been the result of what I think is many different factors, and other people have other reasons and may be able to could definitely contribute other reasons why this would be the case. But a few are that there is an increase in interest in the way that individual levels, behaviors, and attitudes affect the recurrence of conflict, the ways in which fields that traditionally didn't study individual level factors are now starting to incorporate and collect data on individual level factors, and just an increased understanding that mental health and psychological factors are important. And if we're talking about humans and we're talking about human behavior, we really need to think about people's brains and bodies. And to do so, and to not do so, would be to omit a significant contributing factor to these outcomes that we're really interested in understanding better as humans and researchers and practitioners. So Justine and I really want to talk briefly about some concepts that I think were touched upon really nicely earlier today by Mohammed Al-Rajabi on a previous panel, which was grounding the human experience of trauma, which is, what do we mean when we talk about trauma? There's not any one definition. There are definitions that have been laid out. There are definitions that are commonly used by researchers and practitioners and clinicians. But when we actually apply this in our work, what does that mean and what does that look like? So the way we conceptualize and measure trauma and violence is not straightforward by any means. And so for one example of a definition of trauma and trauma exposure, or potentially traumatic exposure, which I'll talk about in a second, the DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, defines trauma as the direct personal experience of an event that involves actual or threatened death or serious injury or other threat to one's physical integrity, or witnessing an event, or learning about an event, or a sudden death. So it can involve you directly, it can involve you witnessing something directly, or it could even involve learning about something and having that thing that you're learning about be sudden. And so it's been noted by other speakers, these events can produce a range of responses individuals. So not every person that lives through a given event is going to have the same response. In fact, 3 people who live through the same event can have 3 vastly different responses. And there are a range of these responses, and this might include the development of various trauma. Oh, if we go to the next slide. This can include the development of various trauma-related distress symptoms. It can include no functional change in behavior, and it can include the improved functioning after, as compared to pre-trauma exposure, something that Dr. Tedeschi talked about in terms of post-traumatic growth. And I think that's something that's really important, and something that I've talked about with a lot of researchers and practitioners and people who've lived through trauma, is that we need to understand better, not just one or the other, but both. Is there something that happens when people live through trauma that can help us understand why that experience might shape their behaviors in the future? Is there something inherent to the symptoms that they might develop, the adverse symptoms that they might develop subsequently, that could inform or help us understand their behaviors and attitudes in the future? It's not enough to just say, oh, you lived in this community that experienced this violence. Really understanding the individual impacts is important for a whole host of reasons, which we'll get into a little bit more, and I'll turn it over to Justine.
Great, thanks, Biz. So we are going to talk a little bit about that last point that Biz brought up in a moment. I'm going to describe a project that we're actually working on that addresses it. But before I do that, I wanted to talk a little bit about my own research and how it kind of fits into this panel about kind of the legacies of trauma and post-conflict political outcomes. And so my research looks at the legacy of civil war and rebel takeover and its effects on democratization in post-conflict settings. And I focus specifically on organizations, civil society organizations that are founded by local leaders. And I do so because we spend a lot of money supporting these organizations and facilitating kind of their democratic potential, their ability to bring peace and social cohesion to their communities. But we actually don't know that much about their experiences with violence and trauma, and how that might actually affect their propensity to be able to actually foster these kind of democratic attitudes that we are particularly interested in. And so I argue that in order to fully understand how exposure to violence affects pro-democratic behavior, we also need to understand the context in which violence is experienced. And so living continuously under government control is going to have a very different effect potentially than living continuously under rebel control on both your ability to participate in politics, but also in the ability of these local leaders to cultivate democratic attitudes. And so I explore the impact of civil war on civil society organizations and their leaders using a multi-methods approach, including in-depth interviews, participant observation, surveys, and lab in the field experiments with local civil society leaders and their constituents in Cote d'Ivoire, which experienced civil war from 2002 to 2011. I find that uncertainty of living that occurs when you live under rebel control can actually worsen cleavages, which lead civil society leaders who lived under rebel control to behave less altruistically and more discriminatory in their responses to their constituents. And this finding really kind of complicates our expectations for post-conflict democratization because it provides a greater understanding of the impact of what may happen if we rely on war-traumatized civil society leaders to bring about democracy, peace, and social cohesion. Okay, and so Biz and I have launched this project where we're doing a review of the literature on the impact of trauma on post-conflict outcomes across a variety of disciplines. We have 5 wonderful research assistants, 4 of which are here today. And they are coding articles that we've collected from political science, economics, psychology, medical journals, geography, sociology, and interdisciplinary journals such as Science and PNAS that look at trauma or violence exposure. And the idea is that we want to know how often are these disciplines looking specifically at the effect of potentially traumatic events versus responses to that potentially traumatic event. And so as of now, this is an ongoing project, we've coded 141 articles from 1991 to 2019, and these articles cover over 70 countries. Here on the left panel, you see all of the different types of violent events violent events and trauma-causing events that are featured in these articles. We also have added an additional 67 articles from 2000 to 2021 that the students are currently coding. We draw from the top 10 journals in all of these disciplines that are listed here. And these articles are coded for the context, the discipline, whether the independent variable of interest is trauma exposure or trauma response, how this is conceptualized and measured. We also collect they are coding the dependent variables, whether they're social, psychological, economic, and political, how they're conceptualized and measured, and then the results, whether there is a positive relationship between either trauma response or trauma exposure and these outcomes. In future analyses, we will examine which disciplines are more likely to study trauma response versus trauma exposure. What are the most common ways that these are measured? So far, we've uncovered that, as many of you may suspect, most of the research methods that are used in these studies is surveys and self-reporting of whether the respondent has experienced trauma or their response to trauma. And so we are also collecting how each study has measured this using the self-report. And finally, we will examine the outcomes and the findings and see where there are divergent findings, whether we see exposure to violence actually increases pro-social attitudes, for example, or voting, or not. And so this is an ongoing project. We're really excited about the data. It is a slow process because you got to read a lot of articles and kind of pull out all of this great data from the articles and quantify what's there. I'm gonna pass it to Biz for this final slide.
And just very briefly, why are we doing this? What's the point? It's sort of the same philosophy or purpose of this conference, which is this is a really hard group of literature, a really hard literature to get to build knowledge on, to build constructive knowledge on. And we really hope to figure out what are some of the findings that do exist. Do they translate across different communities? Are the measures carried that are used in different contexts? Do they make sense across contexts? So as was talked about in other on other panels and in the working group, the issues with self-report data. Are there things that can be done to get around some of those data discrepancies? There are some great researchers, including Vivian Kaderi and Wendy DeAndrea, who's speaking tomorrow for our keynote, using physiologic measures. That might be one way of getting around some issues with self-report. Are the measures developed in local partnership with people? Have they been piloted? And kind of creating a body of knowledge and an understanding that might be able to lead to this next sort of 20 years of this kind of research, and what are the directions in which it can be taken. And so we're really looking forward to having conversations with you about this today, and we're happy to discuss more about the data and the Q&A. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Justine and Biz. One thing that I want to highlight about that presentation is that we're in a panel here talking about how trauma leads to political and social outcomes. And one thing that I took away from that presentation is that when we talk about trauma, we invariably mean a really big and kind of amorphous bundle of things. And so when we get to talking about what trauma does, it seems like we first have to grapple with this question that's been coming up over and over again today, which is what is trauma, what are its various causes, and what are the various ways that it manifests in different people. And I think this is actually a great segue to our next speaker. Dr. Phuong Pham is going to take the floor now.
Thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen for a second. Let me see if I can. First, I want to just thank everyone for organizing this conference. It's been a very interesting day just to hear the latest research. My research vary across disciplines, and trauma is one of the lenses through which we look at, and so it's really nice to see how this work has advanced, and I'm really looking forward to Biz and Justine's final products, your systematic review. So so keep me on your mailing list for that. I'm gonna look at one of the questions that posed to me was, how can we think about how living through and beyond violence and trauma impacts post-conflict and political outcomes. And one of the things that, one of my earlier work, after I finished my PhD, I end up in Rwanda. So one of my earlier work was actually linking how trauma impact people's perceptions, especially transitional justice mechanism that was being implemented in Rwanda. And that was the International Criminal Tribunals, the gachachas and things. And transitional justice is in general is an approach to systematically or massive violations of human rights that both provides redress to victims and create enhanced opportunities for transformations of political systems, conflicts, and other conditions. So ultimately, the goal of transitional justice is aimed at to recognize and acknowledge the dignity of individuals, to provide redress and acknowledge the violations, but it's also a way to prevent these exposure to trauma from happening again. And that was really what really interests me because, ultimately I work in a health field. I'm an epidemiologist by training. And our ultimate goal in our health field is we want healthy individuals and community, And so when we look in these society, where we often work, these are places where infrastructures and systems have failed. And hence, how do, we address this and rebuild the society and rebuild these systems that have experienced this mass atrocity and systematic violence. And so that's where my work really, been looking at. And one of the things, we built a conceptual model early on. And this is, since we talked about method in the last sessions, I always, in any type of research, I always do some sort of visual conceptual models.
Sorry, Phuong, to interrupt, but you're sharing just the PowerPoint page. Do you want to click on it so it'll be full screen?
Yes. Hold on a second.
We go.
Okay, great. Sorry.
That way we can see the graphics. Perfect.
Sometimes when I'm teaching, when I do full screen, people can't see it. But can you see it now?
You might have to stop and restart the share.
Can you see it? Can you see it now? Can you see it?
Yeah.
Oh, that's great. So this was an earlier conceptual framework that we looked at, was to look at, one is, often, after conflict, people rarely consult the affected community and individuals and ask them, what do they want? How do they want, their community to be rebuilt? And so that's what we do often, is we consult with these communities using both mixed method, qualitative and quantitative methods, and ask both community leaders, but also individual affected, and do it in a systematic way as possible. And then we provide recommendations for the development of some of these mechanisms. And then after that, we look at how that impacts those community. And so that's what we have been devoting some of our earlier work. I'm going to advance to the next slide if I can here, sorry. For some reason, it's not letting me advance. Hold on. I'm gonna stop that for a second. For some reason, it's not allowing me to advance the slide. You would think that after a year of Zoom teaching that I've got this down, but I'm gonna, if you don't mind, I'm gonna share it this way. For some reason on my computer, it doesn't allow me to advance unless I share it this way. Let me see if I can go back to. Okay, can you see the page now? Okay, thank you. Sorry. But some of the earlier work that we looked at in Rwanda was looking at attitudes toward how people experience trauma and how that trauma, the results of the trauma, for example, post PTSD or depressions, affects their attitudes toward justice, some of the judicial processes that was happening, but also how they want to rebuild, like some of the reconciliation factors. We also looked at how they felt and defined peace as well. And one of the things that I want to make a note of is, Biz, I think you were mentioning about self-reported measures of exposure. And of course, these are self-exported. And when you get this type of lists and trying to understand relationship, it's really hard because you have a set of lists of things. And so what we try to do is also try to classify them into different groups of types of victims so that it makes the research a little bit easier to understand. You lose some granularity with that, but it does provide some ways of looking at that. And then here, this was how people view who've been exposed and who has PTSD, how they view the mechanism to achieve peace. And what we saw was actually those more traumatized and have symptoms or express symptoms of PTSD or depressions or more likely to support violent means of achieving peace. They also had more negative views of some of the judicial processes that were ongoing in the countries. And then some of more recent work was also looking at built environments, places where they're at, whether they're in camps or out camps. And we find that people who are in camps fare less well than people are out of camps. So the built environments is also important. So those are some of our recent work. But one of the things that you had mentioned earlier, and I wanted to, I had planned to show this later on when we do the Q&A, but I wanted to show you this aspects of this is that, you talk about traumatic and post-traumatic growth. Exposure. And one of the things is when we look at exposure, we don't look at people resiliency, how they adapt and what are the acceptability. We often look at just the individuals, but I think one of the things that we often fail to do is to measure individual asset, like what are their resilience factors that they have, and the community assets that is available in that community to help them absorb some of these shocks that they're experiencing during these events, large-scale events. But I just want to leave that there. I think in the next discussions, we're going to talk about some of the methods, methodological issues. So I'll leave it there for now. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. So just again to recap really quickly, one of the themes that comes up in now the last two presentations by our speakers is the challenge of measuring trauma and representing trauma in our research, or the effects of trauma in our research in a way that makes some sense and has some correspondence to the way the people who are experiencing it would talk about it, or making sure that our measurements are things that they would recognize in their own lives. I'll leave that for now. I want to come back to that question once we get into a little more discussion. But I also know that Dr. Lauren Young has done some research that deals especially with this, with taking people's testimony and representing traumatic experiences and trauma exposures in their own words. I should say I'm not sure if that's what she's going to talk about today, but very pleased to introduce Lauren Young.
Thank you so much, Aidan. Before I start, I just really want to echo others' thanks. Biz, Cecilia, Justine, this has just been, honestly, I think one of the best conferences I've ever been to, very well moderated, and the mix of social psychologists, clinical psychologists, practitioners. I'm honored to be part of this group. So I'm going to speak really from my position as a researcher and as a political science researcher. And I think it'll become clear as I talk kind of why I'm prefacing this. So, you know, I in my kind of personal life and in some of my my consulting work do work on policies, but my comments here are really going to be as a political scientist. My research broadly focuses on understanding how people react to violence in situations where the threat of violence is still very much ongoing. So some of the comments this morning from Professor Neria kind of touched on this, you know, difference between what we think of as, or what at least I think of as the kind of archetypical post-conflict situation, you know, where the threat is no longer really relevant, and it's clearly good for people to kind of reconcile and, you know, be focused on kind of post-conflict outcomes and peaceful participation. The situations or the political context where I've been doing research for the past few years are situations where the threat of coercive violence continues at a pretty severe level. So one context, just to kind of fix ideas in your head, is Zimbabwe, where, you know, the government uses repression to deter opposition supporters from engaging in electoral and non-electoral forms of participation. Another is Mexico, or a part of Mexico, where organized criminal groups use violence against civilians to do things like extort local populations. So, you know, in both of these, the experience of violence is quite high at a personal level, but, you know, there's also for large swaths of the population, just a general expectation that violence, you know, will continue and is still a threat. And I think, you know, in political science, we kind of talk about how there's a kind of growing expectation that this is the type of political violence that you know, is making up an increasing proportion of violence worldwide, right? In many contexts, especially in Latin America, but you know, around the world, violent crime is increasingly prevalent, and state repression. You know, others have mentioned kind of we're in a period of global democratic decline. State repression is unfortunately not going away, although you know, it is declining. So, you know, understanding like the difference in, well, understanding first of all, how people react in the kind of immediate term to coercive threats from the state or from other organized violent actors is really kind of the focus of my research. And I think is, you know, from a political science standpoint, an important element in understanding how powerful actors kind of maintain their power, right? But I think it's one that kind of highlights how, you know, some others have mentioned how, you know, if we conceptualize trauma as something that's already ended, it really kind of puts blinders on us. You know, it makes a certain type of intervention seem like the only kind of relevant solution. Whereas I think in situations where violence is ongoing, it's, at least to me, not always obvious what kind of the right action is from a kind of programmatic standpoint. So, you know, to give an example, you know, in situations where the threat of violence is still present, you know, negative emotions may actually be adaptive, right? Fear is supposed to kind of heighten your reaction to a threat. Anger has been shown through a lot of work by sociologists or political scientists to help people overcome collective action problems. So, you know, while these negative emotions might not be pleasant to experience, you know, to me at least, it's ambiguous whether people, you know, should kind of feel them or should not feel them, right? If we're looking at people's kind of utility, it's not obvious that we should necessarily be trying to reduce the experience of those negative emotions in situations of ongoing violence or situations of ongoing threats. And I think I've kind of mentioned this already, but you know, at the risk of seeming too pessimistic, I think we often lack good policy responses in these situations. I think Professor Dajani kind of mentioned that, you know, in a situation like in Gaza right now, you know, there's only so much that you can do with psychological interventions when, you know, the policy environment continuing to put people at risk. Coercive violence puts its targets into a situation where they have no good option, right? Either they submit and they lose, for example, the ability to have kind of a more democratic system or a better policy, or they defy and they risk being sanctioned with violence. So we can kind of I'll come back to this idea at the end. I'm going to end my comments on a note on research ethics, but from a ethical standpoint, this kind of takes a set of interventions, I think, or it takes a set of methods like interventions off the table to study a lot of these questions. Okay, so to go back to the research question, so why do some people respond to coercive violence with submission while others react with defiance, right? I've studied this in two ways. One, when do citizens mobilize against a repressive regime? And then two, when do residents of a place that's being targeted by organized criminal actors, when do they respond with either violent or nonviolent kind of defiance, maybe with vigilante action on the violent side, or with kind of social movements that put pressure on the state to provide protection on the nonviolent side. And the kind of caricature of how political scientists have traditionally thought of this is that, it's either about resources or it's about people's preferences. Thank you, Aidan. I see I'm running out of time. So generally, generally political scientists have kind of focused on what we think of as more objective or kind of hard factors, like whether you have access to resources or social networks that you can organize along. And I think we're kind of starting to come around to accept that more psychological characteristics like efficacy beliefs, either self-efficacy or collective efficacy, or things like emotion regulation, right, which also was mentioned this morning, may complement these kind of harder or more, supposedly objective criteria that we've typically focused on. So I won't talk, at length about those, but I think those are really exciting concepts that, many of the people here in the audience as well are really working on in their political science research. And I'll end on kind of some open questions. So one, to go back to this dichotomy between, the like objective or hard characteristics like resources and preferences or information versus more psychological characteristics. I think one thing that political scientists are struggling a bit with is where do we really draw the line between the two, right? So I know Cecilia and Isla are I think still in the room. In some of the work that we've been doing together, this has been an issue, right? It's difficult to kind of measure everything, right? Political scientists tend to conceptualize the psychological characteristics as like everything that's left over when you've kind of partialed out the more objective factors like how educated or how wealthy or how much information someone has. So I think there's really a kind of high bar for being able to measure these things well to convince other social scientists that psychological variables actually help explain variation on top of the variation that's more objective or perceived as more objective. And then finally, I just want to kind of circle back to the ethical points that were, I think, really well communicated in the last panel. I think that this is a really big open question of whether the way that social scientists are measuring violence is hurting people. I personally think that it's probably not, but we have very little evidence about it. And so these decisions of whether it helps or hurts or is just neutral are often made by social scientists kind of on the basis of hunches instead of on the basis of like really thorough lit reviews of the kind that Justine and Biz are doing. And I think that to kind of go back to some of the discussion of power differentials and incentives, I think really the only way that we can incentivize ethical research in this area is by making it part of research methods and by requiring researchers to report on all of the kind of qualitative development work that they do in advance, the psychosocial support that they provide throughout the course of the study, and also, measurement of any potential negative consequences. Like all of those things should be reported in research outputs, because otherwise there's no way to accumulate knowledge about them, and there's no, actual incentive for political scientists or economists or other social scientists to be very careful about these. So, I think things like the consort guidelines have really affected, the way that I've thought about this, but the social sciences or political science is, I think, still quite a bit behind in terms of how we, the standards that we have for transparency around research ethics in our publications. Okay, so thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
All right, thank you so much. I'm going to pose a question to our panel. Oh no. Can you guys hear me still? All right, sorry about that. My internet's going in and out today. So I'm going to pose a question to our panel and get their input. And while I'm doing that, I encourage everyone who has questions to please drop them in the chat, and then we'll filter them to the panel in a few minutes here. So something I heard come up in every single person's remarks is that when we're trying to talk about what trauma produces or what traumatic experiences produce in terms of social and political outcomes, we are trying to measure something that is extremely slippery. And as Lauren pointed out in her remarks just there, in the course of trying to measure that, we can also cause problems potentially. And we at least have to be very careful about how we are trying to get at measuring this very slippery concept. So I'm going to ask what I think is like maybe a 30,000-foot question, and I encourage you all to take it in whatever direction you want. But what are some of the best practices you've seen to ensure that we are in our measurement and in our social science representing the diversity of experiences in between exposure to violence and traumatic trauma response outcomes? So what are some of the best practices there? And where do you think our existing tools, whether that be methodological tools, normative frameworks, et cetera, are failing us in trying to measure this really slippery concept? I'll just go in the order I see you at the top of my screen here, so I'll maybe pitch it to Justine first.
So this is a great question. So I think, and this came up in the last panel too about multi-methods research and how important it is. And I work in Cote d'Ivoire, and I've been working there since 2012. And when I first went there, I did not want to ask people about their experiences with the war. Like I didn't want to re-traumatize people, and I didn't want, I was worried about that. And people actually, so I remember I was sitting in my office, and the archivist who worked in the same building, like came in and just started telling me about what had happened to her family. And I unsolicited, and I was like, oh, are you sure you want to talk to me about this? And so I began to realize that actually, like, it was part of, and I think Rebecca Littman said something about how it can sometimes be cathartic for folks to talk through these experiences. But I think it's really important to like get to know the people that you are, the participants, and whether that is actually how they will react, right? You could imagine that there are some cases where people find talking as cathartic and others where it is re-traumatizing. And so I think having extended, time in the field with the communities that you study, getting to know them outside of just like, I want to kind of extract from you for research purposes, but just understanding how people themselves understand the trauma that they've gone through, how they have grown from it or learned from it, or what their response is, just from kind of like a human standpoint, beyond just thinking about them as research participants is one way to kind of overcome this, and to understand, like when we do design, survey questions, for example, the best way to ask it. You can't always just take one off of someone else's survey and put it on yours, because the context is different. And so I think having this multi-method research strategy can really help enhance that.
Thank you, Justine. Biz?
Yeah, I think this is definitely a very important question that gets to a lot of the different things that have been talked about. But I'll just say briefly, I think that the thing that makes most of this research feel worthwhile is doing it in partnership and making sure that the questions that are being asked are not just questions that are relevant to the literature, but are questions that are important to the communities, the heart of communities. And so I think that making sure that it's not just something that it's a question that doesn't just make sense or wasn't just come up with sitting in an office, but it's something that is of interest and of import. In whatever specific context it's being asked. Because again, to Lauren's point, if there's the potential to do harm, and there's this research that's being conducted in a way that could potentially cause any harm, there's no amount of research that should be done without the community's consent. And I think that, you know, as researchers, and to Lauren's point, what consent means and what sort of ethical research means is and should continue to evolve. And so I think that, like, when we're thinking about these measures, the first thing and the sort of lowest bar should be conversations with communities. Kurt Rhodes is here from Questscope, and Questscope has been fundamental in helping myself as a researcher and a number of other researchers think through of ways to conceptualize these questions and what it means to actually ask these questions in a way that would in turn be useful, not just in an academic sense. And like Dr. Dajani said earlier, like, what's the point of science? It's for humanity and it's the accumulation of knowledge. And so I think continuing to have that be the bar rather than just sort of building on the existing protocols or norms that we've had in the past is something that I think is increasingly becoming prioritized, and I hope continues to.
Yes, you know, I agree with everything that Justine and Biz just mentioned. And, you know, just to add to it, I actually, you know, and just to summarize, I think, you know, I think how we conduct research is really important. So the process is really important. And I often think about what they lost when they experienced these traumatic events. And one of the things that these affected community lost is a sense of control and dignity. And I think if we can think of a method and a way that we approach, just based on how we ask the questions, how we approach the questions, how we train the interviewers, it helps restore their sense of dignity and their sense of loss. And so I think that's very often, and that you just don't rush in. Sometimes, you know, you would go in and your budget only allows you 3 weeks to go there, but then don't spend that 3 weeks collecting data. Spend those 3 weeks to understand, and then maybe train others to collect the data after you leave. So I think that's really important. The other thing is, you know, a lot of people mentioned about extractive research, and I often think about that because, you know, in our consent form, we do often say that there are some sort of benefits, and we hope that we would do something with these data. And, you know, one of the things that, you know, we hear often in these communities, that, you know, we never hear back from these researchers. You know, we don't get the results. And so our research team was contemplating on that. How do we do that? And some of the things that we've done early on was actually give the report back to some of our enumerators and have them, you know, at least present them. And in places where we haven't, we had collaborated with local radio station. And what we would do is then present the results there, and then have the local radio stations have, you know, call in from this community and ask questions. It's a small symbolic, but I think it's a way to give feedback because we're collecting data, and they're interested too in understanding how others have experienced the conflict or the trauma too. And so I think that is such an important aspect of research, that we don't close the loop. We often publish, but we don't go back and disseminate to the affected community. So I think that's a really important part of the process. Yes, and I agree with the comments there that you should budget it in. And so if you don't budget it, you don't have it. And you know, one thing I also forgot to mention is that we talk about, you know, this re-traumatizing it. The thing is about this is that in public health, we said that if you don't understand the problem, then you can't solve it. So if we are not asking some of the questions, then we can't solve it, right? So we have to ask these really hard questions.
Thank you, Laura.
Yeah, thank you so much. I won't reiterate the great comments that have come before. I think I would just say, to kind of build on what Dr. Pham was just saying, people's reactions to research are not always negative, right? And so I have learned a lot from reading the clinical psych literature on reactions to research, right? And there are these great, questionnaires that have been used to ask, were you upset at some point during the interview? Did you enjoy doing the interview, right? And they really think about emotional distress and other kind of harms, but also benefits. As kind of the Rebeccas were talking about, it's the mix of harms and benefits, right, that people kind of evaluate. And so, people may be willing to have some level of distress because they feel like they're participating in something that's kind of empowering to them. So they may not regret participating, even if they were upset. I would just make maybe, one other point on, kind of the importance of the research team. And I think this point on dissemination, I think, is so critical. And personally, I respond to incentives, and we don't really get incentivized as academics to do the work of writing the policy report, translating the policy report, going back to the site. So, one thing that I have found useful is to make sure that, there's someone on the team. So for example, for the last project I did in Mexico, we had a master's student from Mexico City who was on our team, who was paid, as a research assistant to write the policy version of our research output, right, kind of under our supervision, and then to present it back to the people who had, kind of advised us and helped us within the local context. So I to kind of go back to the idea of building in kind of local voices to the extent possible, if you are doing this research as an outsider, as I typically am, I think it can be mutually beneficial because, there is a kind of capacity dimension, that's something that in this person's case goes on his CV, he'll ultimately be applying for government jobs. So like, it's nice for him to have that, and also it's a way to, make sure that it actually gets done, because it's really, even though I, can say this is the right thing to do, when you're faced with teaching and advising and, all of the, the reviews that you need to do, it's just easy to not do the right thing. So yeah, thank you.
I think this idea of, or not idea, but this practice of like going back to the community where you've been collecting data and disseminating your research in that community is a really great thing to talk about. I just want to put in a really quick plug before we go to questions from the chat. I also kind of think about it as an accountability mechanism, because when you are going back and you're sharing your research findings with, in my case, a partner organization, or maybe the actual participants of the research, you have to make sure that your representations and your conclusions are going to seem valid and real to the people who are living the experience you're studying. And I find that thinking about that through the research process is actually a really good way to keep yourself accountable. I want to bring in a question from the chat here from Nicole Patierno. Nicole, I apologize if I'm pronouncing your name wrong. Nicole asks if folks on our panel can talk about the benefits and risks of training laypersons. I think this term came up in some earlier panels today, to do mental health care in violence and conflict affected areas. So in the context of this current push to support community mechanisms and non-specialized practitioners to help improve mental health in violence affected communities, how do we think about the benefits and risks of potentially taking this out of the hands of professionals, and where are professionals who can provide more highly specialized services going to fit into this? And I'll leave this just open to whoever wants to jump in.
Well, one of our colleagues at Harvard this has been a great initiative of his, where he actually, because when we often go into these places, one of the things we look at is to see even resources. Some of the earlier panelists has mentioned about, we're required to refer our participant if they have experienced any distress to them. And when we compile these lists, I realized that there may not be that many resources. There may be one psychologist in the country early on in certain places, or few. And so when you don't have these type of resources in these community, you have to build it. And so training local communities to do that is a great way. Also for social culture, I see a lot of benefits in that. They understand the culture, they understand the community, they have languages that they can use and people will understand. So I see a lot of benefits. I fail to see negatives, only because there's such a lack of resources. If there were alternative and more professionally trained, then I can see some issues being raised. But right now, I only see the pluses in training local community to support people who have experienced trauma.
Yeah, I think building on that, one thing that is sort of is important to think about is the way that these programs are evaluated. And I think that this gets at the same conversations that we were having before about engaging and making sure that whatever community is carrying out these new kinds of mental health and psychosocial care programs are also engaged with defining the ways that the evaluation is measured. So what are the actual outcomes that are important, and are they important to the funder? Are they important to the organization? Are they important to the individuals? Those are a different set of, you might want to collect all of those data because all of those might be important when speaking to different audiences, but I think that the audience that is most commonly left out is the actual people who are participating in the program, and also the trainers that have been trained, making sure that the voices of the trainers who are part of the program, who are imperative to it being carried out, are also being incorporated in developing the research questions, are incorporated in communicating the findings. And I think that this is especially, as Lauren was talking about, being an outsider and doing research, if the trainers that are being trained are within and from the community, then their voices should be the ones, and they're carrying out the program, and they are sort of building momentum for this new way of providing care at a broader level, at a scalable level, making sure that their voices are at the forefront of these conversations. Feels like kind of one of the, not only like the most straightforward and most logical way of making sure that these programs work and are grounded in sort of like the realities, but are also, it's ethically important and very practical.
I'll just bring in a couple more things that are in the chat for your responses. The first, Kurt Rhodes points people to the field guide for barefoot psychology, which I think we'll probably hear more about tomorrow in some of the sessions with folks from Beyond Conflict, as an example of doing research that kind of integrates at all levels of the community you're studying. And then Patrick Vink points out that there's not much research right now into local means of dealing with trauma. So means that fall outside of like a Western dominated mental health and psychosocial support paradigm. And I think that we maybe hear about this in using a number of different terms in the political science literature, for example, where we talk about like creation of historical memory or ways that communities, ethnic groups, all sorts of different descriptive groups of people process their own history. But opposed to you question or provocation, how do we kind of integrate studying those types of means of dealing with trauma that fall outside Western mental health paradigms? How do we integrate that into our way of studying trauma and its social effects?
I can jump in with the first thought on this, although, I mean, I think this is one of the places where as a political scientist, we have a lot to learn. But I would say, Aidan, you mentioned at the beginning that we've had conversations before about kind of mixed method or multi-method research. I do think that this is a place where political scientists need to get more comfortable with qualitative methods. And the way that I have tried to deal with this in the research setting of Mexico or Western Mexico is to make sure that you have really serious qualitative work that you ultimately also try to publish, right? Because I think, we can do some qualitative interviews initially, but if we don't really analyze them in a serious way, for example, in the way that you do, Aidan, in your work, we can kind of just do them and form some assessments and then move on. But with quantitative surveys, you're really limited to only find what you're looking for at the outset, right? With experiments, perhaps even more so, you're only going to find what you have decided to manipulate a year before you actually do your study. And so, it's hard to see how you would learn about kind of more local customs or more local ways of dealing with conflict, with trauma, without really intensive qualitative methods. And those should be part of publications, not just the fancy quantitative stuff.
Yeah, and building briefly on that, I think that one thing that doesn't seem like it should be a barrier and very often is the level of analysis that you're working at. And so whether or not you sort of have to pick a lane. And I think that a lot of sort of local approaches to dealing with mental health, in the US, we might be much more sort of conditioned to think of mental health as you're an individual, you go to therapy, it's one-on-one, maybe group therapy. I think that the idea of sort of what Patrick was talking about in the chat of having these sorts of established means of dealing with trauma and past histories are often embedded in the community, and it's not this individualistic thing. And so making sure that it's an understanding of, yes, we're talking about individuals and the way that they are operating, but they're really embedded within a community. And if these practices are embedded within a community, how are we accounting for them and how are we thinking about them? And so it's not just the sort of one or the other, it's the mutual constitution of both of them and the way in which we sort of conceptualize thinking about them and incorporating them into research and practice.
Yeah, I'll make a plug for Paul Bolton. He does a lot of these work in trying to develop therapies for local community. And he's a medical anthropologist. He does a lot of these really good qualitative research that was just mentioned. So,
Justine, if you'd like the last word, I think we're coming up on closing time here, and this has been a really great discussion.
Yeah, I think it's been a really great discussion, and I've been looking at the chat too. I think Patrick's point about what we were just talking about, like local means of dealing with trauma, is super important. And also, this has come up, but thinking about partnerships with local organizations and understanding that is also crucial. And yes, I also will put a plug in for mixed methods research and how important it is to get on the ground and talk to people. I think that, and I liked Phuong's point about how you have to, even if you have a short period of time, you can use that time to get to know the population you're studying, and I think that's super important. So we are at time. Aidan, did you wanna have any last words yourself?
Sure. Yeah. I'll just say, when you get a lot of political scientists together, you're going to start talking about power in some sense. And one of the things that one of the concepts of power that's come up a lot here is about incentives, and how doing ethical research, effective research that reflects the experiences of the folks we're studying is really a matter of incentives, or having enough power within a social group to operate beyond incentives. So just to all of the folks with the money and all of the folks with the hiring power in the audience today, I'd encourage you to keep in mind what our panelists said. So now I think that we're going to kick this discussion into a breakout room for people who want to continue. And I believe that Justine is creating that breakout room. And then I believe I am handing the microphone back over to either Justine or Biz. So thanks in closing to all four of our panelists. This was a really interesting discussion that went in directions I was not expecting, and I was very glad to be here for it.